Good afternoon. I am Professor Asher Sasser, speaking to you from the university in Tel Aviv. And the topic of my discussion for the next 10 or 15 minutes will be about Israel and Hamas in the new Middle East, and I will try to place the events of last week in some broader regional perspective and explain what I think the motivations of Hamas were, what the results of the campaign have been so far, and perhaps a word about Israel's dilemmas and the relationship with the US to conclude. So I would start by explaining the new regional setting in the Middle East, which I think is the framework for the discussion of what happened last week. The clash between Israel and Hamas last week was very much a result of what people in the West call the Arab Spring. And I think that the Arab Spring has been misunderstood by many in the West to be a struggle between the forces of democracy and the forces of autocracy in the Middle East, when in actual fact it is something quite different. The Arab Spring is a struggle between the forces of modernity and the forces of tradition. This is what has really taken place, and this is another round of a struggle that has been going on between the forces of modernity and the forces of tradition for the last 200 years. And what we have seen in the Arab Spring so far is the unquestionable victory of the neo-traditionalist forces. In the last 50 years or so, there has been a very serious retreat of the secular forces in the Middle East, and the trends of secularism and secularization that had been going on in the Middle East for the last 2 centuries or so have been seriously eroded by the forces of tradition, which are mainly 3. The Islamists, Islamic politics, sectarianism, and tribal politics, like in Libya and Yemen. These are the forces that have risen to the fore in the Arab Spring, not the forces of secular democracy, but the forces of Islamism, religious sectarianism, and tribalism. This is not very new, and this process of retreat of secularization has been in the works for some time. And in the Palestinian arena, as you will all recall, in 2006, Hamas won the elections in the Palestinian territories, not the PLO. And the victory by Hamas in 2006 is very much part of this trend of the rising power of the forces of tradition, Islamic politics, and the decline of secular nationalism as represented by the PLO, for example. In Egypt in particular, the Islamists have overwhelmed the secular liberal forces. Those that the Western media focused on in the early days of the Arab Spring have lost the political fight in Egypt. It is not they who rule Egypt today, but the Muslim Brotherhood. And the rise of the Muslim Brotherhood to power in Egypt is a great boost for Hamas. Hamas is an organization of the Muslim Brotherhood. Therefore, those who rule Egypt today are members of the same organization that Hamas represents. This is a huge strategic improvement for Hamas in comparison to the Egypt of Hosni Mubarak, which saw the Muslim Brotherhood and Hamas as enemies. So Egypt of the Muslim Brotherhood is Hamas's strategic depth. And the rise of the Muslim Brotherhood to power in Egypt and the general enhancement of the public voice in the Arab countries of the Arab Spring has pushed Israel into a position of greater regional isolation. the publics in the Arab countries are now more free to express their views, and their views invariably are extremely anti-Israeli. So you have a situation emerging in countries like Egypt, and in Jordan it is pretty much the same, where our peace treaties with these countries are beginning to look like ceasefires or armistice agreements without the warmth or the depth or the reliability of real peace treaties. For Israel, the region is beginning to look more hostile, somewhat more similar to where Israel was after the war of 1948, where our relations with the Arab states were not governed by peace treaties, but by armistice agreements. And our relations with Egypt and Jordan today look more like armistice agreements than real peace treaties. So Hamas sees the new reality. The new reality for Hamas is wind in their sails. Israel is isolated. Egypt is in the hands of the Muslim Brotherhood. So Hamas decides to rewrite the rules of engagement with Israel. The escalation along the border with Gaza was an escalation initiated by Hamas to rewrite the rules of engagement with Israel. Hamas would fire at Israel more often, more regularly, and more lethally because they felt that they would enjoy Egyptian support and that Israel would be very careful not to retaliate with too much power. Israel, isolated in the region, so Hamas thought, would be very cautious about eroding its relationship with Egypt. And Hamas felt that they could attack Israel with greater frequency. Israel would be cautious not to retaliate with full force, and Egypt would support Hamas. But Hamas miscalculated twice. They miscalculated the Israeli retaliation, which was much more fierce than they imagined. And they miscalculated the measure of Egyptian support for Hamas, which was much less than what Hamas expected. Egypt will not go to war with Israel. Egypt will not abolish its peace treaty with Israel. Egypt will not endanger its national security for the sake of Hamas. So Israel could retaliate with great force, which it did. Just to give you a number of the indication of the amount of force, Hamas fired 1,500 rockets on Israel in that week of fighting. The great majority of the rockets fell in open areas or were knocked down by Israel's Iron Dome. Only about 50 rockets of the 1,500 actually fell in built-up urban areas. Hamas succeeded with this 1,500 rockets to bring 1 ton of explosives into Israeli cities. The Israeli Air Force brought 1,000 tons of explosives, smack on target in every place in Gaza. So Hamas miscalculated very seriously. And Egypt made a great effort to induce Hamas to cease the rocket attacks, because Egypt did not want to be drawn unwillingly into a conflict it doesn't need. Egypt is facing economic bankruptcy. It cannot afford a war. It cannot afford a head-on collision with Israel. It cannot afford a rupturing of its relations with the United States, which are essential if Egypt is to have any chance for economic recovery. So Egypt didn't behave as if it was an agent of the Muslim Brotherhood. Egypt behaved according to the state interests of the Egyptian state. Therefore, acting very similarly to the way in which Hosni Mubarak would have acted if he was still in power in Egypt, much to the surprise of Hamas. So we have a ceasefire, which has lasted so far for 1 week. We don't know how much longer it will last. But Hamas has to think very seriously about the price of restarting the confrontation with Israel. There is a ceasefire agreement between Israel and Hamas which is very vague. Both sides have agreed to stop firing at one another, but there is not much else which has really been agreed upon. Israel wants to prevent the rearming of Hamas with rockets that will come from Iran. This will require Egypt to be very active in supervising its border to prevent the introduction of arms back into Gaza. Iran and Hamas, needless to say, will not cooperate with this effort to prevent the rearming of Hamas. And therefore you have the makings of what might be another round between Israel and Hamas in the not too distant future. If Hamas tries to rearm, Israel will prevent it by force, and that may be the beginning of another round of confrontation. Israel's objective was to exact a price from Hamas that would be so prohibitive that Hamas would be very cautious about restarting the fight with Israel. Whether that has been achieved or not, only time will tell. Israel operated in Gaza also with an eye on Tehran. Israel demonstrated its military proficiency, its very accurate and quite outstanding intelligence in delivering a very severe strike against Hamas. Unquestionably also directed to the attention of Tehran, but also by degrading the arsenal of Hamas rockets, by destroying about half of all the long-range rockets that Hamas possessed, or maybe even more. The great majority of the long-range weapons have actually been destroyed. Israel is creating a situation where if and when it does decide to attack Iran, Hamas will not have that many rockets ready to fire into Israel at Iran's behest, as the Iranians would have wanted it to be. So Hamas has suffered a very serious military setback. It has lost a lot of its rocketry. An important segment of its military leadership has been decapitated. And much of the physical infrastructure of Hamas in Gaza has been destroyed. On the other hand, Hamas has emerged from this war politically stronger than it was before. The Palestinians see Hamas as continuing the fight with Israel. Hamas is still there. They are still in control of Gaza, and they will remain in control of Gaza for the foreseeable future. There are not too many in Israel who are that enthusiastic to reoccupy Gaza, which is what would have to be done to remove Hamas. And so Hamas, because of the continued fight with Israel, have reinforced their political position throughout the Middle East and amongst the Palestinians in particular, leaving the PLO and Abu Mazen looking rather feeble and irrelevant. Therefore also the determination of Abu Mazen now to go to the UN to try and obtain international recognition for this non-member status for the Palestinian state, as a way of also re-establishing himself within Palestinian politics. But there can be no question that the Israeli effort to unseat Hamas through economic sanctions over the years has failed. And what Israel should learn from that is that it is too tall an order for Israel to try and engineer Palestinian society for them. what the US should have learned a long time ago, that it cannot engineer Iraq or Afghanistan as they would like to do, Israel cannot do in Gaza either. So where do we go from here? Israel has a very serious dilemma. On the one hand, to keep Israel Jewish, it cannot remain in control of the territories it occupied in 1967 forever, whether it is Gaza or the West Bank. But as we've seen, withdrawing from Gaza, as Israel did, has its dangers too, as Gaza has been taken over by Hamas and become a base for all the rocket attacks against Israel. So Israel is locked in a dilemma, and as we go into the elections now, and as we come out of these elections in 2 months' time, sooner or later, we are going to have to think very deeply about what it is that we do about this dilemma. The territories are advantageous for security purposes, but for Israel's long-term Jewishness, they are a liability and not an asset. The last point I would like to make in this introductory remark is about the United States. There was a lot of discussion before the elections in the United States whether it would be better for Israel if Romney were to have been elected, or better for Israel if Obama would have been elected. And there were many in the Jewish communities in North America and elsewhere where people seemed to believe that the re-election of Barack Obama would be very bad for Israel. At least judging from the campaign in Gaza, the United States has been very firm in its support for Israel. Surprisingly, not only the United States was very firm in its support for Israel, so was much of the European Union. And I think it was firmly understood in America, as it was understood in Europe, that Israel was acting in legitimate self-defense of Israel proper. And this is a lesson for Israelis to notice. When Israel is seen by the international community defending Israel proper, it enjoys a great measure of international support and legitimacy. When Israel seems to be defending its territorial expansion after 1967, it has much less international support and much less international legitimacy. And that we should think of as well. So I will conclude my remarks here and gladly field your questions or your comments as they may be. Please, the floor is now yours. The first question is, can I see an Israeli, Jordanian and PA front against Hamas? I don't think so. I think that even though Israel, Jordan and the PA all have their reasons to oppose Hamas, I cannot see the PA and Jordan cooperating with Israel in such an effort. Jordan has to deal with its own Muslim brethren, who are the strongest part of the opposition in Jordan, and as a result I think would be very reluctant to appear to be operating together with Israel against Hamas. And today, after the recent round with Hamas, considering Hamas's popularity amongst the Palestinians, I think the Palestinian Authority would also be very cautious about appearing to be operating together with Israel against Hamas. So I think that that is probably not in the cards. And what is more likely is a Palestinian community in which Hamas has somewhat more influence rather than less. And that is something that we will just have to face as we move into the future. We have to think perhaps of ways and means of reinforcing the PA's position, that is Abu Mazen, but that is not going to be terribly easy either, because the present initiative by the PA going to the UN for the recognition of the Palestinian state is something that Israel is not very pleased with either. So that is where we are at this time. There is another question: what was included in the ceasefire agreement? First of all, this agreement was rather vague. There is a document, but neither party actually signed it. There is an agreement there for the parties to cease the armed confrontation for the meantime, a ceasefire. That is firmly agreed by both parties. Israel also agreed to relax its border restrictions along the border with Gaza, to allow fishermen in Gaza to fish more freely in the Mediterranean. Egypt is supposed to open its border with Gaza, but the commitments here are not very clear about exactly what it is that the parties have to do. Israel expects, although this isn't written into the agreement, Israel expects the cooperation of the United States and Egypt to prevent the rearming of Hamas with the smuggling of missiles from Iran or from Libya through Egypt into Gaza. In the last few days, there have been reports of Egyptian forces intercepting smuggling attempts from Libya. There is a ship that we know has left Iran for Sudan with arms for Gaza that will be shipped to Sudan and from there to Egypt and into Gaza. But since this is known that this ship is on the way, I have doubts whether this ship is ever going to reach the Sudan. Someone will probably see to it that it doesn't make it. Who that will be, we do not know, but I would imagine that this ship will have a hard time getting to where it intends to get. Another question is, how can Israel allow a Palestinian state to develop while also managing the security threat from Hamas and other proxies of Iran? It's a very, very difficult question to answer. There are no easy ways of doing this. But there is one thing we do have to remember. Israel withdrew from Gaza and is dealing with the rocket threat from Gaza without reoccupying Gaza. Despite the fact that the Israeli withdrawal from Gaza has been followed by this kind of constant conflict, Israel has no great appetite to reoccupy Gaza, which has nearly 2 million Palestinians living there. So in fact, Israel is dealing with the threat from Gaza without renewing the occupation. It might be possible for Israel to think of ways and means of withdrawing from certain parts of the West Bank, not all of it, and not all at once, just as a way of reducing the friction with the neighborhood and testing the waters for the possibility of the creation of a two-state reality, not a solution. And there is a reason for that. Even though a two-state reality between Israel and Gaza is a very problematic affair, by avoiding a two-state reality, we are slowly gravitating into a one-state situation. In a one-state situation, the Jews eventually will become the minority. That is not a situation that Israel can sustain over time. And therefore the dilemma I mentioned, that we have to think of ways of withdrawing from certain areas to enable the emergence of some kind of two-state reality, but at the same time defending ourselves effectively from the rockets that may fly from territories that Israel withdraws from, as we have done so far with Gaza. We have developed over the years, since the withdrawal from Gaza, and by the way, since the war in Lebanon in 2006, we also withdrew from Lebanon unilaterally, reoccupied Lebanon, by the way, in 2006, the south of Lebanon, and withdrew from it again. So Lebanon also shows that Israel really doesn't have much of an appetite for occupying additional Arab territories. This is true of the war in Lebanon in 2006, and has shown to be true in the confrontations we have had with Gaza twice now, in 2008 and 2009, and again now in 2012. We have developed the Iron Dome missile defense system, which has been amazingly effective. Israel has an offensive strategy. The airstrikes, the targeted assassination of Hamas operatives, there are ways and means of meeting the challenge effectively militarily, perhaps without having to continue the occupation with the price that that brings with it. And this is the dilemma that we have to try and contend with effectively. I agree that there is a great deal of difficulty there, but we have to give it a try for our long-term interests. Would I comment about the US sending troops to protect the Egyptian-Gaza border, as reported in Debka file but not in the New York newspapers? I doubt very much whether the US would do that. I think it sounds very doubtful to me that the US would send troops to the Egypt-Gaza border, certainly not in any great number. And I think that what we need on the Egyptian-Gaza border is not American troops, but rather a more determined Egyptian effort to control the border from the kind of smuggling that goes on there. This is something that the US should not send troops to Gaza for, but to put pressure on the Egyptians to carry out themselves. This is Egyptian territory, and Egypt should have a very strong interest to preserve the security of the border zone in order to prevent the rearming of Gaza, because the rearming of Gaza is bound to lead to another round of conflict between Israel and Hamas, and another round of conflict between Israel and Hamas could very well be very damaging to Egypt's own strategic interests. So that is something that the Egyptians would have to bear in mind, and I think the solution there is to get the Americans to put pressure on Egypt to do what Egypt has to do as a sovereign state, rather than the Americans sending troops there. I would not like the perception to be in America that Israel needs American troops to defend Israel. I think we have always said that we do not need that. We have always said that we will defend ourselves, and I think it wouldn't be good for Israeli-US relations if sometime down the road American soldiers are killed in what Americans would see as fighting to defend Israel. We should be able to defend ourselves, and Egypt should protect its own border and should be encouraged by the United States to do so. Well, if there are, I don't see any more questions, and if there are no further questions, thank you for your attention. Thank you for giving me your time, and I look forward to being able to do this at some other occasion in the future when developments in the region require it. Thank you very much.